operating for another 10 years. So they paid this guy $10,000 for the PDP-8 that he was using as a coffee table. And implemented it into the power plant, and it ran out its service life. That's probably the further we get. It won't probably be necessary to have a PDP-8 functional in any application relatively soon. So the basic emulation flowchart, which is entirely bullshit, it basically is the exact same architecture as the physical architecture, just implemented with code. You have the source code, which is input as a document to an instruction processor, which maintains the virtual state, or the state of the virtualized hardware. It has an array of memory locations that it uses as the memory for the device. Any peripherals that are important to the system would have to have their effects simulated, but they're mapped into the virtual memory in the same places they were in the original hardware. In most hardware designs, most of the chips are just there to make sure the signals get from the memory to the processor, so you don't have to implement the exact logic gates that switch memory addresses, as long as the result is when the processor asks for this memory, the memory provides the right data and quick enough that the processor reads it. That's really all that's necessary from an emulation standpoint. So virtual machines, which I'm not going to get into, are basically the same thing. They're generally running on hardware that can run the source code directly. They emulate specific pieces of hardware that drivers are standardized for generally. That's the sum total of my experience with it. DOSBox is probably the first example of an emulator that most people would have a use for. Let me see how easy this is to switch to. DOSBox. It simulates all the functionality of DOS, which really isn't that much. You can mount directories from the host operating system onto it. It does the file name translations if it has to. I tried to download a program, but unfortunately it's a DOS program that has a Windows installer. So I really can't do anything with it. I tried downloading a copy of the WordPerfect 5.1 floppy disks, but I can't get them to mount for some reason. But yeah, you can run most DOS software. I've used this to play several different games that I actually have on CD that I used to enjoy playing from the DOS era. You have to remember to use the / mount. This is a command specific to the DOSBox, which gives me a C drive and a CD Word. PD one dot 1 plus. That's annoying. So how many people have DOS experience? Most people, okay. It does. It does emulate the 8086 architecture on whatever platform it's running on. It does handle the funkiness that got around the 640K ought to be enough for everyone. Philosophy of early computers, when people needed more than 640K and the operating systems functionally had no ability to address it, they had to make some workarounds. Paging the memory, the XMS and the EMS systems. It implements the FAT file system, and it also emulates all of the early graphics and most of the audio hardware that was available. The Tandy graphics was actually amazing, but only supported by computers manufactured by Tandy. Amazing for its time. Hercules, monochrome, high-res, CGA, EGA, VGA, and the VESA standard are all emulated by DOSBox. And once you get past that, you require special drivers. But most graphics hardware would emulate VESA mode at its minimum. So if you address the VESA hardware with with Visa commands, then it would work. All of the fancy high-resolution stuff was all implemented by drivers for specific hardware when things got proprietary. The Disney Sound Source was a parallel port device that made sound. It sounded okay, but it literally occupied your entire computer, so it wasn't able to do much else when it was playing sound. But yeah, it would write audio data out through the parallel port on your computer. Alright. Next, wine. Wine is a recursive acronym for wine is not an emulator, so we'll skip it. Okay, actually I probably should have done this first. What's the earliest computers that you guys actually have experience using?
ZX80.
Oh, which?
ZX80.
ZX80 processor, do you know what?
The Sinclair ZX80.
The Sinclair, yeah. Oh yeah, that was, Sinclair ZX80. Like the one with the memory keyboard?
The Z80.
Yes,
Yeah,
so
Z80.
so that particular computer was designed as cheaply as possible. There was no hardware that drove the graphics.
It was the Raspberry Pi of its day.
Yep.
Actually, it was slightly less than the Raspberry Pi.
It was less than the Raspberry Pi of its day. It was made so cheap that virtually all of the processor's power was required to display the screen. When you press a key, it temporarily had to blank the screen to process the keystroke and then pop the screen back up. It could not display the screen and process any data at the same time. That's how unbelievably crazy this design was, but they made it as cheap as possible. So the earliest computer that, I believe the earliest computer that was available for the average person to purchase in a fully assembled function is the Altair 8800. That's the entirety of the system as it was originally released. The only input and output functions this thing had were the switches and the lights. If you wanted to enter a program, you had to manually set the switches, store and next. Set the switches, store and next. It had single step functions so you could review the program or run the instructions one at a time to make sure things were working. Its original kit came with 256 bytes of memory, and it had many spaces for installation of expansion slots, so you could add more memory, you could have peripherals. They eventually made disk drives for it. Tape readers, serial ports you could have installed to an interface for the terminal so you could actually type on it the way we're familiar with for the computers. But in its originally form, it did not have any of that.
That would have been a paper tape reader.
They had paper tape readers as well. They did actually have a disk drive for it. And I believe it could support up to 3 disk drives at 300K per disk or something like that.
And was that?
Huge computer.
When was it first made?
1969, I think? Or 76? Was it that late? Yeah, it might be that late. And if I switch to... So one of the neat things that people have done, JavaScript, even in a browser on modern hardware, is so much more powerful than this old computer hardware that you can have an 8800 functional. If there was speakers, you could actually hear when you flip it on, you can hear the fan. And actually,
Probably overclocked it too.
and if you listen closely, it simulates the sound of the switches. So you would enter a program like this, and then you would hit deposit next, and then you set for the next memory address, deposit next. That's how you would enter a program on this. What this emulator provides that the original hardware didn't is this little panel down here, which tells you exactly what the registers are currently doing and the memory addresses, since there's only 256 of them.
So that's the entire RAM dump in there.
Yeah, pretty much. It scrolls a little bit. Yeah.
Let's go down.
Actually, it's only half of it, yeah.
Yeah.
This is scroll bar.
Yeah. So, just to give you an example, this is a game for the Altair 8800. It's called Kill the Bit. It is, 15 lines of assembly code. This information out at the bottom there is the octal code that makes it easier to enter the switches. That's a fully functional game on this device. I tried entering it into here and it didn't work, and I'm not sure why. But basically, a little light starts scrolling along the address lights, and as it passes a switch, you have to flip the switch on and off really quickly to try and hit that bit. If you miss it, then another light appears, and then you'll have to hit them both. So the objective is to kill each of the bits. It basically does it by forcing the processor to access the high memory locations without actually writing any data to them. And whenever you flip a switch, it just XORs that with the current value in memory, which is why it adds a bit if you miss, and it subtracts it if you don't. But it was a game, and it worked on those physical switches. They eventually had BASIC and the CPM operating system that all worked on this hardware. It was a 2 megahertz 8080 processor from Intel. Yeah, it's. So I saw a video of somebody who actually got their hands on an unopened Altair 8080 or 8800, whose serial number was 47. It was unopened in a box. All right. So, there are a few online emulators that I found. So this here is an emulation of the PC hardware. If you want to see what, this is an emulation of an IBM 5150 computer with 64K of memory. This is what it looks like when you start the emulator, but then you eject the virtual disk before it has a chance to boot. This is the BASIC that was in the BIOS of the original IBM PC. I do remember this. And as a couple of examples here, if you were ever curious as to what it would be like to run OS2 version 1.0 on an 8 megahertz IBM PC. This is what it looked like. Okay, I'm going to watch those two command prompt. And I don't remember the keystrokes required to switch between control escape and it. No, if I hit control escape, it's being grabbed on my OS. So, yeah. But I can do that. And then, no, it doesn't work. There's a couple of other examples that they've got set up here. There's this game here that basically simulates getting a job. I played it for about 10 minutes. Windows 3.
I remember that color.
Wow, it's all been downhill since then.
Yeah. All right. All right, and a couple of other things on this website. Anybody work with PDP 10 or PDP 11?
I still have a PDP 1170 in my basement.
Sweet. So you probably know way more about this than I do.
Well, you know, I'm kind of thinking of that now.
It's probably the nuclear plants, which is more scary.
So
Sadly, mine will not kill.
I know a guy who sold a PDP
Yeah.
to Paul Allen.
So if I load up the operating system disk and then tell it to boot. Oh, and then, yeah, there we go. And it boots it. I have no idea what happens with these switches, but they work. So, definitely in terms of showing people who are learning computer hardware, what we came from. It can simulate loading and reading the tape. And one of my favorites, which I just noticed this afternoon,
Oh, no.
a functional calculator. I didn't get a chance to look it up, but for people who have used the HP 48 series calculators, they're completely different paradigm of entering the numerical data. You enter the two numbers and then you tell it the operator. Yeah, reverse Polish rotation, so you can stack up a whole bunch of numbers and then apply the operations retroactively. I had one, I never really used it that much, but people who love them a lot. I think that's everything I have for online emulators. Basically, what this website has is it has JavaScript implementations of various processors, which makes it easy to string together, like having an emulation of the 8086 processor and an emulation of the CJ graphics adapter in JavaScript. Just attaches them together. This website actually, you create XML scripts which define the systems that you want to play with. And nothing else there I think is not that interesting to look at. And if I just click this, no, it doesn't. All right, so most people my age grew up in the era of the 8-bit computer. Anybody use, I guess, the Timex Sinclair, the early one? They got better as they went along. They eventually had a fast mode and a slow mode. The computer would normally operate in slow mode, where it spent half of its time doing the graphics and half of the time processing. But you could switch to fast mode if you want to do a bunch of calculations and didn't care what the screen showed. So I've mentioned here the Fuse Sinclair, but there's actually one that I like a little bit better. So I'm going to show you quickly. Tools, keyboard. This is what the keyboard looked like. Rubber chiclet keys. Every key has more than one function. And it completely tokenized all of the basic language. So it's very difficult if you don't have this in front of you, and unfortunately the program won't leave it on the screen. I have to close it. But if I wanted to, say, enter a quick basic program, I would type 10, and then I hit P, and it assigns the print command. The quotation marks, I have to hold down Control, which would have been the symbol shift, and hit P. And then, hello, plug. I hit G and it puts go to, and 10, and 9. And there it is. All right.
So while you're in the quotes, it automatically changes context to put in real characters
Yeah.
instead of the word.
Yeah.
It's pretty decent.
Considering how terrible it was typing, the fewer times you actually had to hit the keyboard, the better. If I want to load, I am going to switch here, and I'm going to select downloads a game called Horace Goes Skiing. So what I've done is I've just loaded up the tape file. Then I go back to the emulator and I rewind the tape. Oh, hold on, I'm gonna do it. Now I just take back to rewind the tape. Tape rewinded. Then I type in load, but that's not on the L. That's on the J key because I already used L for let. And I happen to know that the program is called skiing. Now it's waiting for me to start the tape. When I hit F6, this is what the screen would actually show. When it's red and blue, it's looking, and when it's yellow and blue, then it's loading. It apparently actually made these horrible sounds when you're actually loading from a tape. And although apparently it was continuous when you were actually loading, you would hear the tape through the computer screen. Yeah, Horus this was the second game in the Horus series. The first one was basically a Pac-Man clone, and it was this character they created. And unfortunately, I have to figure out how to slow this down. But you have to go across the street to buy some skis and then go skiing. There's a whole series of games involving this character named Horus. So, anybody use an Atari computer? You probably used them all, right?
Good. 400 was the best.
I don't have those emulators set up, but the Atari ST series. Oh, there we go. There's one. This was the first emulator that I found that really, because I never had one of these, but I had a lot of friends that did. So
$1,000 for a 100 megabyte hard drive.
yeah, yep. So in here, you get to. I'm going to load a configuration I've already done here. But you can configure the system, which one of the Atari series you want to emulate, what CPU it has, because you can actually play around and put CPUs into different machines, how fast the CPU is running, whether or not the floating point unit's installed, the operating system image. There are a lot of the operating system images available for download. This one, however, is an open source project that recreated the Atari operating system. So somebody cared about it enough to actually create an open source project that recreated it. The same look and feel, all the functionality is there. You can attach a hard disk. You can load floppy images, so that the floppy disk is actually in the drive. So I'm going to browse. Is it still downloads? Yeah. And screen configuration I'll leave the way it is for now. And then you launch it. Including from a virtual hard drive, running the open source recreation of the Atari software. And so if I open up this disk here, launch this application. At the bottom of the screen, you can see the emulation of the hardware lights for floppy drive access, hard drive access. I don't know what the other stats that it's showing are. And SimCity. Old school. You can do this, which makes it a little bit easier to use the computer, but when I started using computers, I was using 640 by 480, and now I cannot do literally anything at that resolution. I don't know how we lived.
I had a Macintosh monitor that was 512 by 384.
Yeah.
I remember having windows where the OK button was below the bottom of the screen. Because they didn't know that screens that small existed.
Yeah. So for people, the one thing that the one market that these computers had for the longest time, even after they stopped being manufactured, is people who created music loved these machines because the software for digital music creation existed. It was basically industry standard. The computer came by default with MIDI ports. As far as I know, the musician Norman Cook, who's better known as Fatboy Slim, his entire studio is still based around an Atari ST computer that he uses for music production because it's just what he's known for so many years. All right, now something that's a little bit larger of a project. Vice. X64. Commodore 64. You go to settings here. If you have a 64 NTSC revision 2 with the fancy SID model, which one of the floppy drives that you had? The original 1540, I believe, hard drive had an error in its BIOS that limited the drive speed to like a quarter of what it should have been. And in order to maintain compatibility with software, several of the next models that they released had to keep that bug in order to continue to work. It simulates all that. You can actually turn on, you won't be able to hear it, the simulation of the rather noisy drives that these things had. The computer was capable of having up to 4 drives, although I've never saw anybody with more than 2. You can define what printers you have attached to it. And then you can, also, you can attach a disk. See a thing here? So if you load $, what this does is it loads from the disk, similarly. Oh, did I hit enter? There we go. Oh, you can hear it. What that loaded was, it loaded the directory of the disk as though it was a basic program. So then you list it as though you were listing a basic program. And if you had a basic program in memory and you take a directory, it gets replaced by the directory of the disk. Then it did have a shortcut here if you type in load and then I believe it's question mark. The comma 8 identifies the first floppy drive attached to the system. That will load the first thing that's oh, that wasn't it. That was a star, probably. Yeah, there we go. It loads the first file it finds on the disk that's identified as a program. So you would find that all commercial programs would have the executable as the first program that was listed there. And it's going to take a moment to load. Actually, I'm not going to wait for it because I'm almost out of time. And SimCity for the Commodore 64, absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. But in addition to the Commodore 64, a slightly more sophisticated machine was the Commodore 128. Somehow there's the ability to get this to boot up CPM. You can also give the command go 64 and it just resets and becomes a Commodore 64, which did a couple of things. It would shut off the output of the RGBI port because the 64 didn't have it, and it was, is it go 80? I can't remember the command to turn this into an 80 column mode, which the Commodore 64 didn't have. So by switching to this Commodore 64 mode, it shuts off a couple things and it cuts the processor speed in half in order to be compatible with the old system. The later Commodore models had a hardware monitor built in so that you could access the memory addresses directly if you were doing machine code. There we go. And also, it has all of the other options for that too, but what surprised me is I remember the Commodore PET being the first computer that I used at school. I don't remember exactly which model it was. But it does actually simulate that as well. And these were actually fairly powerful, sophisticated business computers. Again, the options for the different models that it emulates. The numbers basically corresponded to the graphics character set capability. The 8032 has an 80-column display. Does do the Super Pet. You can acquire the ROMs. University of Waterloo partnered with Commodore and produced a series of replacement ROMs for the computer that provided a whole bunch of advanced business functionality. You can get a copy of those and you can load them up on here.
Were they wire wrapped?
Sorry?
Were they wire wrapped?
Well, they were just ROMs. There was actually expansion slots, which were just empty ROM sockets. That yeah, you can have up to 128 megabytes of memory, and and again, you can attach the disks. I created a blank disk and I stored a program on it, and you can load it up. All the commands are the same as the Commodore 64. And I had one more demo I wanted to do with this. I don't remember. I'm also time. So I'm gonna skip it. And so, gaming consoles. This is obviously where a lot of the legality would come into play here. I'm not worried if I show you a program that's been pirated. I'm not selling it to you. And pretty much all of the consoles, if they don't require more processing power than a PC, like the modern ones do, there's probably an emulator available. There's Nintendo emulators, Sega emulators. I didn't bother setting up all of them, but I did set up one, because there's a story behind this one. Oh. So this is an emulator of the Atari 2600. By today's standards, this system is terrible, but it was a huge gaming console for many years. There was a few later editions, the 7800. What I forgot to mention was there are still people making modern software for all of this old hardware. There are people that are making games for the Commodore 64. There is somebody who just released a cartridge game for the Atari 7800. A brand new cartridge for the Atari 7800 as of like 3 months ago. There's a guy on the internet who pretty much obsesses, and he's got a fairly decent YouTube career based on playing around with all this old hardware. The 8-bit guy, if anybody else has seen him. But he wrote a program a few years ago called Planet X1, which attempted to make a strategic combat simulator for the VIC-20. And he wasn't able to do it without a 32K memory expansion module, because the VIC-20 had 5K of memory, and half of it was used up by the operating system. So BASIC had 3.5K available when you powered it up. So he released that for free, and I wanted to get it running, but I couldn't get it running on the emulator. Then he made Planet X2, which is basically a real-time strategy game on the Commodore 64. And he sold it, and sold quite a few copies of it. And then his Planet X3 game has been targeted specifically at the Tandy 1000EX computer. So the earliest Tandy computer with the Tandy graphics hardware. It supports the Tandy graphics hardware, it supports VGA, and it supports CGA in 4-color and composite mode, which can simulate multiple colors. And he's creating new games for this old hardware. I'm assuming somebody, because the development kits for and the ability to make cartridges for the Atari 2600 still exists. I only have one game that I download, E.T. Anybody know the story behind this one? This game was so terrible that they didn't sell it. They boxed it up, took it to the dump, and threw it away. And a couple of years ago, some people figured out where in the dump it was and dug it up.
What?
This game is absolutely terrible. It makes no sense. You walk around. It gives that arrow, it tells you which way you're supposed to go. You randomly fall into a hole and have to fly out of it. go this way. Then, and then you get grabbed and carried into here. And then you walk out of there. I don't know if anybody actually knows what you're supposed to be doing with this game. It was terrible. They decided not to sell it, they just threw it away. But somebody dug it out. So, but yeah, obviously there was lots of Atari 2600 games that were made available over the years.
So is that like the pre-internet version of the archive.org? Or?
Knowing where in the dump it was, yeah. All right. So there is one particular project which is trying to tie all of this together. The MAME project. It was the MAME project and another project called MESS, Combined Forces. Their lofty goal is to accurately document the hardware of classic consoles, arcade systems, and computers in order to preserve historical software. Of course, the best documentation would be one that will test itself. So they're documenting the hardware in source code. So what they want is to be able to have a library of programs that will emulate the hardware of all these different machines. The arcade machines, a lot of them use the same hardware with just different ROMs in them. So as long as you have an emulation of the hardware in that cabinet, there's certain graphics devices that were created that made arcade games a bit fancier. Those have been emulated. The processor, most of them use the Z80. And they've also expanded into consoles, or into computers and consoles as well. So I do have that set up as well. Unfortunately, I wanted to have a lot more of this working, and I got distracted yesterday, and then never got a chance to work on it, and I wasn't able to get everything I wanted running today. But
It's almost 9 anyways.
yes, so it's working out just about right.
So you did exactly great timing.
Yeah. Except that I can't do this.
Almost done. I don't know.
Shit. I have to change my graphics configuration because it only puts it on the primary. All right. So I'm going to finish up with the presentation. Anyways, I'll skip the last slide. So, this was. We're going to unify the outputs. So let's see what we get when I do this. Oh, I don't want to unify it. I want to. Oh, mirror. Okay. And disable that one. I'm going to reject this. Here we go. And okay. So here is the video game that I played in the arcade, spent a lot of my money on as a kid. This is the details of the machine. It used two Z80 processors, one of them at 20 megahertz and one of them at 4. And specifics of the audio hardware, graphic output. Wonder Boy Monsterland. You have to simulate putting in a quarter, which is mapped to the 6 key. And then 1 is the key to start it. And so you go around, you collect money, you buy stuff, you're trying to destroy something. I spent so much money on this. And I always got to this one boss at the end of one of the levels, and I could never beat it. And I found this, and I installed it, and I played it, and I played it, and I played it, and I still can't beat that boss. They've also got ROMs. My first computer was this, the TRS-80 color computer. This is actually the TRS-80 color computer 3 being emulated. It's got the disk interface cartridge emulated. I don't know how to make this work with virtual disks. This computer has no lowercase character set. I've typed a lot of documents on a word processor called Color Scriptsit where lowercase characters were just color inverted. I eventually found a program which loaded up in graphics mode and would draw 51 character text mode with the lowercase character set for doing actual work on it. I got through high school with this. I didn't buy an IBM PC until I went to university. And it had some fairly sophisticated programs. A couple of years ago, somebody managed to compress a video file of Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope in a way that it would play on this hardware.
Oh my god.
It looked like crap and it sounded like crap, but you could actually tell what it was. It was really impressive. And I also don't know how to escape from this. Because all of the keystrokes for the other emulations get captured by this, and I don't know. So I know I can do this, and oh, no, that's not the terminal I need. This is the terminal I need. And where is it? Maybe it's that. Doesn't matter. I'm gonna type. So yeah, I thought this was pretty cool to be able to actually play with the old hardware, because some of this old hardware, if you actually wanted to get it, is pretty rare. The other thing that I didn't show was some of the lesser known Commodore models, like the Commodore Plus 4 and the Commodore 16. There are emulations of those as well. The Plus 4 was not actually compatible with the Commodore 64, but it did come with 4 applications built in. It had a built-in word processor, spreadsheet, database program, and drafting program, which were not that useful. And plus it wasn't compatible with Commodore 64, so obviously that product failed. But yeah, the number of projects that are being attempted to be emulated by MAME is very ambitious. They're intending to have emulations of the 8-bit computers, 16-bit computers, all the arcade consoles, all the home consoles, so the arcade cabinet games. It's an ambitious project, and it's not completely unrelated to the open source mindset that you want to make sure that knowledge isn't lost. If you did need to make one of these old computers work, like apparently right now there's almost nobody alive anymore that understands vacuum tubes enough to actually design something with them. Yeah, there's just knowledge that isn't used anymore. Apparently the Russians built guidance computers for their jets out of miniaturized vacuum tubes, and when the Americans saw them for the first time, they went, because they were immune to EMP pulses, so they would get knocked out of the air by nuclear explosions. Yeah, it's lost knowledge that people do actually want to keep going. And yes?
Quick comment about Pong game. The first Pong game did not use a processor.
No, I did read something about it. Yeah. Yeah.
It was what? Just the LED section signals, horizontal, vertical, and the mean.
Yeah. Well, the first time a computer was ever used to generate music, they wrote programs on punch cards in Fortran that did absolutely nothing except cause EM emissions to come out of the machine that would be picked up as notes by a transistor radio sitting on top. Somebody figured out that they could compose music by writing nonsense programs that generated EM that sounded like music. And I was told a story by my teacher back in college that one school was given access by the government to a really expensive computer that It had a big panel of lights on the one panel, which on the one side, which is apparently activity for each processor or whatever it was. And government officials came by one day to see what those students were doing with the computer. And they walked into the room, and the bat symbol went across those lights. Apparently, it was not easy to do because they basically had to write a program that would trigger certain processors within the system at certain times to make the pattern. But they were depressed. Any other questions? Cool. That one out.
All right, thank you very much, Brent. That was both weird and cool.
Yeah.
Let's go for it.